Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Today we'll be looking into the death of Charles C. Morgan. Charles Morgan was a successful businessman who ran an escrow agency and who was mysteriously abducted and found shot to death around 33 feet off the highway in San Juan Springs area. We'll be looking into his background and evidence to see if we can come up with any leading theories, because till this day this crime is still unsolved. So we'll be looking into that. But yeah, just to remind you guys, I value your guys' time. So as usual, I hope you guys enjoy the video. So let's begin with a little bit of Charles Morgan's background. Charles also goes by the name Chuck, and that's how we will be referring him as for the rest of the video. Chuck was a very successful businessman who was the owner of his own escrow agency, who lived in Tucson, Arizona back in the 1970s. Also, I would like to get out of the way that Chuck has been doing some shady business behind the scenes. Chuck had apparently been known for money laundering and has been using his escrow business to launder large sales of gold and platinum that were worth billions of dollars. Interestingly though, Morgan kept duplicate records of these illegal transactions, hoping they would help him in the future. Chuck was also a potential witness in a state land fraud case involving a known crime boss. Now, with that out of the way, we can lead our way back into the timeline. On March 22nd, 1977, Chuck left his home to drop two of his daughters off at school. Later that night, after he did not show up to work, his wife Ruth obviously grew worried and filed a missing person report on him. Chuck vanished into thin air and was not seen again for the following days. After 3 days, Chuck's wife Ruth was woken up by some knocking on the back door. When Ruth opened the back door, she noticed that it was Chuck. According to Ruth, he was missing a shoe, had a plastic handcuff around one ankle, and had his hands tied together with a plastic zip tie. Ruth mentioned that he shook his head and pointed towards his throat to indicate that he couldn't speak. Ruth then continues to ask him, "Can you talk? Can you write?" Chuck nodded his head and got a tablet and a pen and wrote down that he had been painted with a hallucinogenic drug, and that the drug could drive him irrevocably insane or destroy his nervous system, and ended up killing him. He then asked his wife to move his car as he didn't want them to know he was back. When Ruth repeatedly said she wanted to call the police or at least a doctor, Chuck refused, stating that they would put a whole hit on the whole family. Over the course of the next week, Ruth would nurse Chuck back to full health. Once Chuck's voice had returned to him, he then went on to explain to her that he had a secret identity as an agent for the federal government and he fought against organized crime. Ruth stated that he wrote down, "They took my treasury identification," and that this was the first time Ruth had ever heard of this, and that he had been working with them for over 2 years. He said that he escaped from his captors near Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. After his kidnapping, Chuck became very paranoid. He started wearing a bulletproof vest and started to drive his daughters to and from school and assured the school that he should be the only ones picking them up. But on June 7th, 2 months later, Chuck would disappear again. Shortly before his second disappearance, he told his father that if anything were to happen to him, there was a letter he had written that would tell him who was responsible. That letter was never found. 9 days later, an anonymous caller would call Chuck's wife Ruth and proceed to tell her a reference from the Bible that goes the following. "Chuck is alright. Ecclesiastes 12:1-8. This is referring to a passage in the Bible, which I will read briefly. "Men are afraid of a high place, and of terrors on the road. Remember him before silver cord is broken, and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth, as it was, and the spirit will return to God, who gave it." 2 days after this incident, Chuck's body would be found dead in the desert 30 feet off the highway in San Juan Springs area. He was shot in the back of his head with his own magnum and was lying beside his body. During the crime investigation, investigators found some odd discoveries. In his car, there was an oddly amount of ammunition. His car had been altered to unlock from the fender. There were no fingerprints at the crime scene, including none on the gun. Chuck's hand had gunpowder. Interestingly, Chuck was right-handed and the powder was in his left hand. In the rear seat of the car, one of Chuck's teeth was wrapped in a white handkerchief. A piece of paper with the directions to the spot where he died was found. Also a pair of sunglasses that did not belong to Chuck. The strangest discovery though was that Chuck had a $2 bill inside his underwear. Written on the bill were 7 names. Above the notation was arrows to indicate the same Bible verse that Chuck's wife Ruth received from the anonymous caller. On the back of the bill were the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who were numbered through 1 through 7, and there was a drawn map. The map led to an area between Tucson and Mexico known for smuggling. However, for some reason, even with all the strange discoveries, the authorities still ruled it out as suicide. The authorities went on to explain that Chuck had shot himself in the back of the head, but many people, including Chuck's wife Ruth and an investigative journalist going by the name Don Devereaux, believed that not to be the case. They were almost certain it was a murder. 2 days after the death of Chuck, a mysterious woman going by the name Green Eyes called the police department and provided some strange information about Chuck. She had went on to claim that she had met Chuck in a motel shortly before his death and that he showed her a briefcase containing thousands of dollars in cash. Chuck has supposedly told her that the money would buy him out of a contract the mob had put on his life. Authorities were able to confirm that Morgan had in fact stayed in a West Side motel over a week before his death. Shortly after Chuck's death, his impounded car was broken into while it was in the police possession. Around that same time, his office was also ransacked. 3 weeks later, Ruth Morgan was visited by 2 men claiming to be from the FBI, and she claims the following: they opened and closed their identification very fast. They said they wanted to come in and look through the house. They never said what they were looking for, and to this day I don't even know what they were looking for. The agents who hurriedly showed their badges stormed into Ruth's home and destroyed the whole place looking for something that they never found. Ruth, obviously shaken, didn't get the chance to write down their names. Don Devereaux, the investigative journalist, contacted the FBI and requested they release information in the Morgan case under the Freedom of Information Act. He was denied as the FBI claimed to not know who Charles Morgan was. On May 14th, 1990, Doug Johnson was shot in his car right outside his office. Why do I bring this up? Well, Devereaux, the journalist who was looking into the FBI, lived across the street from the parking lot where Johnson had been shot. Devereaux was certain he was killed by a hitman who had been hired to kill Devereaux, not Johnson. They both work very close to each other and drive the exact same car, so it is very likely that they mistaken Devereaux for Johnson. Also, very oddly, the authorities ruled out Johnson's death as suicide, even though he had no gunpowder on either of his hands and there was no gun in sight. A year after Doug's death, another investigative reporter going by the name Danny Casolaro wanted to spread some more information he found about Chuck's case to Don Devereaux. Devereaux naturally asked Casolaro to send him the information, but before Casolaro was able to, he was found dead. A cleaning lady had found Casolaro's body in the bathtub of a motel in West Virginia. His wrists were said to be sliced and slashed about 12 times with a razor blade. Now, Casolaro's family refused to believe that he committed suicide using this method. According to Casolaro's brother, who was a doctor, stated that Casolaro was very sensitive to sharp objects and squeamish. The way of suicide is out of the ordinary, but even with this information, very oddly, again, the authorities would rule it out as suicide. Throughout all these deaths, it is said that the FBI is trying to silence any information known about Chuck's case. Now, you do have to remember that in the beginning I mentioned that Chuck was involved with some money laundering and working with organized crime. He owned an escrow business and used that to launder money. He also did some real estate work for at least one mafia family, so it is very likely that maybe he just knew a bit too much and he had to be silenced. But since this crime is still unsolved till this day, let's look into some of the theories and let's see what we can come up with.
Okay, so for this segment in the video, I decided to pull out the whiteboard and do it on here because I never use the whiteboards. We're going to hop onto the theories and do it on this whiteboard, and I will explain what I think. Theory 1, if I can write, don't worry, I used to be a teacher, was that it was actually a suicide. Now, this theory can make sense, I understand. It is said that he actually committed suicide and that maybe after his first disappearance, he just got like very paranoid and maybe he didn't want anything bad to happen to his family, so he decided just to end it all. So he just took himself out, but this leaves many like things unanswered and just unsolved in general. Like all the discoveries at the scene and the mysterious caller and Green Eyes, like they're just all unsolved. Also, Ruth explains that he would never leave his daughters behind, so this theory is just, I mean, it's there, but it just has a lot of holes in it, and I truly believe it was a murder, not a suicide. So this theory just doesn't add up too much. Theory 2 was that he was killed by the mob. So this theory can make sense. It definitely has that foundation to back it up and stuff like that. You have to remember that Chuck was involved with a lot of like crime organizations and money laundering. So maybe one of the mob bosses just got very unhinged and uncomfortable and just decided, hey, Chuck knows too much, we have to take care of him. And he just started to get a bit worried. So maybe he just wanted to solve that problem by taking care of Chuck. Also, you have to remember Chuck was a witness on an illegal activity testimony. So he did see some illegal stuff going on. So maybe one of the mob members just decided, hey, you know, he knows this information, we have to take care of him. This one is quite possible. Chuck did carry out some escrow work on a couple mafia families, so maybe that had to do something with it. But this theory is quite interesting too. It definitely is there. And yeah, theory three was that he was killed by the FBI or some secret service. Now, this one definitely is up there as well. You know, it's quite reasonable. It definitely has that foundation to back it up and just stuff like that. Because Chuck stated before his death that he was working as a secret service for the government. But I do want to let you guys know that this isn't confirmed, but we'll just go along with it to see where it goes. Also, one of Chuck's daughter, gone by the name of Megan Heidi, has also stated father had a lot of information about people here in Tucson that could have been very detrimental. There was a lot of information about politicians, people who are still alive that work in our government. He had that information and they wanted to silence him. Chuck did keep records of all these illegal transactions, so maybe when the FBI busted into Ruth's home, they were looking for these records and all these illegal transactions. So this one is quite possible that he was killed by the FBI / Secret Service. It makes sense. Also, it seems odd that after Chuck's death, and all these journalists were going after, looking deep into Chuck's death, all died, and they were all ruled out as suicide. So it is very strange. Let's say he was killed by a mob or some gang. I don't think the mob or gang would care that much to leave little clues at the crime scene, but I feel like the FBI would. So most likely for this theory is that the authorities knew that Chuck had some dirt or some beef with some of the politicians or had some illegal transactions going on, that the FBI just didn't want Chuck to release the information, so they decided to take care of him before he can do anything. But at the end of the day, there are still some details that I wish I knew. We never knew if the handwriting on the $2 bill was actually Chuck's handwriting or if it was someone else's, or we don't know if there was any type of struggle at the crime scene. Or I wish they did more investigation on Green Eyes. For some reason, Green Eyes was left out of all this. The FBI knew that Green Eyes or this anonymous caller had some information on Chuck, but they just completely decided to leave them out. So I do find that to be a bit strange. But here's my final take. And I know it's a bit of a stretch, but I just want to bring it up. So my last theory that I truly believe, after going through all the articles and information, I couldn't find a theory about this, and I just want to bring it up. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but hear me out, right? It was the wife that killed him. It was the wife. There we go. Okay, now this is a bit of a stretch, but just hear me out, right? The wife's story is very bizarre when you hear it again. It just doesn't, it has a lot of holes in it. Pretty much all the evidence from this case comes from the wife. From how her husband was kidnapped, how he had some weird drug that didn't let him speak, to the strange phone call that she received. Maybe she did make all this crazy mob stuff up and she's just lying. The thing that I'm saying is that there's no proof to her side of the story. You know, all the evidence just comes from her mouth, so maybe she's just making some of this stuff up. Maybe, if you think about it, maybe Ruth was Green Eyes and the anonymous caller this entire time. A bit of stretch, but now I know what you're thinking. What about the other deaths? What about the journalists that died trying to look into this? I do believe that those journalists died because they were looking too deep into the investigation. I believe that Casolaro and Johnson were legitimately looking into the mob and the FBI and got killed for it. But yeah, that's my final theory. Maybe it was the wife, you know, because there's no proof of her side of the story, so maybe it was her. But at the same time, it's kind of a stretch because who would want to kill their own husband? We have suicide, the secret service, the mob, and then finally the wife. Out of all four of those theories, I do believe it's probably the third one. I'm sure the FBI or some type of authority had to do something with it, because Charles did have a lot of dirt and just all these illegal transactions to do with money laundering and all this. So I truly believe that the FBI was probably behind it. However, we will probably never know because of what happened, because there's just so many strange little holes in this story that it's kind of hard to see who's telling the truth and who's not telling the truth. So yeah, I'll just leave it as that. I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing if you do enjoy this type of content. And yep, that's pretty much it. Bye.